Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. This video was requested after my previous One Punch Man video of how strong is Garu. Much like that Garu video, we'll be going over each form of Boros, starting from the Armoured Boros, Release Boros, then to Meteoric Burst Boros, and then an extra section just going over the Collapsing Star of Roaring Cannon. Going for a bit of background on Boros, we can look at his conversations with Saitama. When he first meets him, he says something confusing of how he's splendid to see his minions and nothing to Saitama. You'd think a boss would care about his minions, but he obviously doesn't. He introduces himself as the part of the Dark Matter Raiders and the ruler of the universe. Now, while this seems like a really impressive thing, we don't actually know if Boros rules other worlds, nor do we know if they've gone to other worlds and raided them. Most likely they have, but I don't know how many, as it's never said. What we do know is why he's on Earth and why he goes around world to world. He goes around world to world, including on Earth, because of a prophecy that was made 20 years ago. The prophecy was made on a planet that he went to conquer, and they made him leave the planet because he expected to find an opponent in 20 years who could give him a good fight that he would be happy with. He wants a good fight because he's actually so powerful that he is just bored in the universe. He wants something actually challenging to do, and this is why he is on Earth. Some more backstory we get on Boros is after he attacks Saitama and is in his release form. He talks about how his home planet had some of the harshest climates he'd ever seen in the universe, and because of such, he's got the greatest recovery ability in the universe. In fact, in his species, which had the best in the universe, he was the best of the lot. The reason being is he had so much latent energy, he could easily speed up any healing process. This means he should be able to survive things better than that of characters such as Melzagard. And not just that, he should be able to do it much faster than Melzagard too, as long as he has energy, which, considering it's Boros, he has a lot of energy. Now let's talk about our first form of Boros, Armoured Boros. Let's start off with some basic scaling to get Armoured Boros higher than his generals. In fact, Armoured Boros is way stronger than his generals. Unlike the anime, in the manga, Saitama defeats one of his generals, the telekinetic one, in front of Boros. In fact, he does so mocking him and throwing a stone through his head, splitting him in half, and Boros' reaction is splendid. They are nothing to you. The implication here is he's happy he meets someone who can one-shot his generals. This is really interesting for the implication that if he wants someone strong to fight him, then being stronger than his generals is one thing, but being able to one-shot the generals like they're nothing is a complete different thing. Now, moments after this, Boros actually gets caught lacking and punched by Saitama. He got caught lacking so bad that Saitama's not even drawn on the panel where he gets punched. This could be because Boros has the ability to sense people's energy, yet he couldn't sense the limit to that of Saitama's energy. So he probably underestimated him, or his idea of fighting Saitama would have been more along the lines of his released or later forms where he himself is much more powerful. Once again, if you remember my How Strong is Garu video, you'll remember that in that video we talked about what a one-shot difference is inside One Punch Man and for general power scaling, and we got a 10 times difference. We'll use this because we know Armoured Boros should be happy dealing with anyone who would be a one-shot difference over that of his generals. But in case you're wondering why it's a 10 times difference, here's a reminder from that video. There is a thread on Versus Battle Wiki going over what they think a one-shot is. They think it's the difference between human level and street level, like a tier difference in attack potency. I agree with the idea that it should be a tier difference in attack potency. However, the tiers are not the same size and are quite spread out. So instead of just saying a tier difference in attack potency, it'd probably be better to look at what is a tier difference over every single tier. If you do so, you can work out the mean and the 95% confidence interval. When I did this, I removed all the ones that showed outliers outside the 95% confidence interval, which gave a mean of 10, a lower bound of 7.8, and an upper bound of 12.1. We'll use the mean of 10 as this is also consistent with One Punch Man. In One Punch Man, as we remember, Deep Sea King is implied to be 10 times the average A-class hero while in his dehydrated state. Deep Sea King fights 3 A-class heroes, Stinger, Lightning Max, and Snack, and his history against them sort of shows a one-shot difference. I say sort of because he one-shots 2 of them under circumstances and 2 shots Lightning Max. He one-shots Stinger while Stinger is weakened, and he one-shots Snack while Snack is against the hydrated version, which is much stronger. So in One Punch Man, it is likely slightly larger than a 10 times difference, but we'll use a 10 times difference because it's a nice round number. Let's start off looking at the feat done by the Psychic on Boros' ship. He's able to throw rocks, as Murata stated, at sublight speed. So let's calculate exactly what this is. Starting off with first how big the rock is. We'll start off with Saitama, measure his head size, then compare that to the rock itself. Next we'll count the number of rocks, and if we do so we get a total number of 15 rocks. We can use the average rock density to get the mass of one rock to be 2.7 kilograms, making all of them, all 15, over 40 kilograms. Next we'll be using the sublight speed statement and some extra context Murata has provided. This extra context in question is the fact that when throwing these rocks they are not limited by the friction of the air, but it is still sublight speed. Now you can have the speed of light in air where what happens is air will slow down the light as it gets in the way. If these are sublight speed where it's not limited by the air, it is likely faster than the speed of light in air, but slower than the speed of light at its full speed. This makes it around 99.97% the speed of light. To work out the kinetic energy to do that, we have these rocks moving so fast that they have a mountain level amount of kinetic energy. Now this next feat we're going to cover is an anime only feat, and that is of the squid telekinetic seemingly making a black hole. Now I don't believe this is actually a black hole, and neither does Murata. If we go back to that same interview mentioned just a moment ago, he should have said a black hole seems too powerful for this character. However, the description we get in the anime is that he is pulling things down like a black hole in a way that light wouldn't escape outside of his telekinetic bubble. So we can reverse engineer this to try and work out the energy of his pseudo black hole, or better, well, it should just be called a gravity well. Starting off using the Saitama head we used earlier for a perspective distance for where these monsters are, as the monsters were in fact the very edge of this gravitational effect. We can do that to find out the surface gravity of this gravity well, being extremely high at 512 trillion times the gravity of Earth. Then we can work out the volume of this effect, finding out how much is inside, and it's shown that it works on everything, not just organic beings, including like the rocks in the background. So we can get a total volume of nearly 3,000 cubic meters, a theoretical total mass of 8.2 million kilograms. We can work out the max force of this ability, which we can then convert to tons, just to show how massively strong this is. Now the max distance it will ever move will be inside the gravity effect, so it should be the radius. So times the radius by the force, we get the work done energy at country level. However, we can actually take this a step further. If we go back to the Murata interview we've been using all this time, it actually implies that Shoop, the psychic telekinetic that is on Boros' ship, might actually be more powerful than Tatsumaki, or at least more powerful than the Tatsumaki we see during Season 1. Obviously, on the Monster Association arc, we've got much more feats to show that she's far more powerful. What this does mean, though, is we can use any feat from Season 1 for Tatsumaki that could be directly shown and scale Shoop higher. If you're wondering if Shoop should be stronger, we can also use the data book that says that Shoop is the strongest telekinetic in the universe, which the Shoop's strongest telekinetic in the universe statement would even apply to characters at the start of Season 2, right before the Monster Association arc. Some more scaling we can do for the general scaling to the ship more than Tatsumaki's damage is what we can do is we can talk about how when Saitama got on the ship, within just 4 minutes, he does some crazy things like beating one of the generals, and in that 4 minutes, destroys 23% of the ship. Now, this 23% of the ship was said directly to Boros when he showed up, so this is all he knows. He then hears this and says to one of his generals to just get the other 2 generals and deal with this person. In fact, he's disinterested in someone who can only destroy 23% of the ship in 4 minutes. His tone changes, however, when he hears that one of his generals is already dead. What this means is he would expect all 3 generals to easily be able to destroy 23% of the ship in 4 minutes, and in fact would expect that none of the generals would have died to the intruder so quickly. This is again before Boros actually realizes how powerful Saitama is, that he can one-shot his generals. In Season 1, Tatsumaki is able to stop, reverse, and throw back the projectiles from the ship faster and harder than the ship itself can.
What happened?
Hey, aliens! Take your shells back!
Now, one feat that happens in both the anime and the manga, and stated directly, is the first volley on City A completely destroyed City A instantly. Like, boom, and it was gone. Now, City A is absolutely massive. There's a world map of One Punch Man, and if you look on this world map, you'll find that City A is a large part. In fact, it's the largest city in the world. So large, in fact, that when destroying a city of this size, we get a multi-continental attack. This is the energy that Tatsumaki and any of Boros' generals should be able to scale to. As you know, we should know that Tatsumaki is more powerful than the ship's blast, so she's definitely, even in Season 1, stronger than multi-continental. In fact, all 3 of Boros' generals should all scale to this as well, from the scaling mentioned earlier. Armoured Boros is happy to see one of them get one shot. A one-shot difference in One Punch Man is at least 10 times. Therefore, Armoured Boros should be this amount of energy, which is still multi-continental. Now, if you remember, just a moment ago we talked about how one of his subordinates could throw rocks in near the speed of light. Now, Boros literally sees Saitama grab this and throw it faster than it was originally intended, literally stating from Saitama very casually that anyone can throw him like that, and kills his subordinate. This happens in front of Boros, and Boros is happy to see it. This would very much imply that Boros is able to move at this speed or be happy to combat someone at the speed of light. Now, if you think me saying that Boros can move at the speed of light is too high, you should actually check out this calculation on Versus Battle Wiki for Saitama casually reacting to Gregan Shoop's light speed attacks, in which this calculation gets Saitama to 4.35 times the speed of light. Now, if you think that's the high end, so perhaps it's the low end you should scale to, this calc also only assumes that the attacks are moving at 75% the speed of light, and as mentioned just a moment ago, it's more likely moving around 99% the speed of light. So even this calc is being a low end, and it is several times the speed of light. So saying Armoured Boros is the speed of light is definitely a nice low end. Also, once again, using information said just a moment ago, when we were calculating the effects of the anime gravity effect, we found that it was 512 trillion times that of Earth's normal gravity. We can apply this to Boros and say that he should be able to move around on this, considering he's above his subordinates. Boros' weight is unknown, but we know his height at 2.4 meters. Compare that to the average height of a man and the average weight of a man, we can then say that Boros' weight should be around 229.51 kilograms. This means the force on Boros' body, should he fight a subordinate, is absolutely massive, so much that when converted to tons is 117.7 trillion tons. For a quick summary for Armoured Boros, we say that his attack potency is multi-continental, his speed is the speed of light, and his lifting strength would be 117.7 trillion tons. Just for reference, inside One Punch Man, Multi-continental attack potency, as well as being fast and light, is the type of standard we'd expect for both Armoured Boros and that of Orochi before he does any adaptation, evolution, or any amps whatsoever. The first thing we need to do before we actually talk about release Boros is to look at where Saitama was right beforehand. Saitama is holding back at this point, and Boros actually compares to him, so let's first talk about Saitama. As we mentioned earlier, Saitama was able to punch so fast that he didn't even appear on panel when he blitzed and punched Boros. We're going to lowball this, and how we're going to calculate it is assume Boros is the speed of light, which we've previously shown. Armoured Boros should be the speed of light. And then we're going to make it so Saitama's fast enough that he could move that distance between them faster than Boros could move a single meter. So we start off using the panel where we can actually see how far away they are from each other, find out Saitama's height, Boros' height, the panel width, we get the angle and the distance for Saitama, 3.5 meters, the angle for Boros, and then the distance for Boros at 8.17 meters, the distance of the blitz, 4.62 meters, which means, if we assume the Boros didn't even move a single meter, which he didn't, that makes Saitama 4.62 times faster than Boros, which again, Armoured Boros should be the speed of light, so that makes Saitama 4.62 times the speed of light at this point in its suppressed state. After this, when Boros starts fighting with Saitama, it starts off panel, we don't actually see it. The first thing we do see is when Saitama has disarmed Boros, literally. After this though, with only one arm, they start fighting blow for blow, consecutively for quite a while, until Boros, with just one arm, actually outspeeds Saitama. This should make Boros at least 2 times faster than the level of speed Saitama previously had, with the implication that he actually must have gotten faster and started trying harder in between. How much? We don't know. So if we get the previous amount of 4.62 and we times it by 2, we get an amount of 9.14 times the speed of light. Even though Boros is almost 10 times the speed of light, most likely is 10 times the speed of light, in just his release form, he's actually better known for his power rather than his speed. Like in right here, we see a massive blast over Boros' ship, which is comparable to the ship in size, and straight afterwards, a back fist so powerful it's able to split the remaining ashes of that same blast. We will be calculating both of these. First, we need to find out exactly how big Boros' ship is. Now, when scaling the size of Boros' ship, it will take a lot of images. Starting off with this one, where we can see the difference between Saitama and the width of the corridor. We get the corridor is 7.15 meters wide. Next, we scale this corridor to the entire panel, for which this entire panel ends up 109 meters wide. We then zoom out to the next image, for which this next image is much bigger, to the point where the panel width is now 478 meters wide. Then we zoom out to the next image at 1257.5 meters wide. Then we zoom out to the next image at 2357.6 meters wide. Then we zoom out to the next image at 4688.6 meters wide. Then we get to our final image, finally, where we'd say the width of this ship is 8583.95 meters wide. However, I then realized I had actually made a mistake. You see, later on, when Meteoric Boros punches Saitama, we have the exact same image, except from large portions of it now being vaporized, but it actually tells us the orientation of the image. So in fact, the actual line that would be the width of the ship is downwards, so the width of the ship would actually be 6168.59 meters. Now we have the size of the ship, we can then compare it to find the energy of those 2 feats mentioned. Let's start off with the explosion. It's stated that we are vaporizing the bone, and when we see this, we can see it's going through parts of the ship and is basically inside this white area of the large explosion. We can compare this to that of the width of the ship, as mentioned just a second ago, to find out its volume. We'll use the vaporization of humans down to the bone, as stated. Therefore, the energy we get is not as high as we expected, only island level. For the next feat, we need to measure a little bit further out. After all, we are now involving the ash cloud, not just the explosion. And when we involve this ash cloud, we then need to find its mass within this volume. It's quite heavy, but not as big as we expect. It gets split in 2.8 seconds. This gives a speed of 2.2 thousand meters per second. With this, we can get its kinetic energy at large island level. Impressive, but not quite what we were expecting. Now, if we look at Boros' ship, we can use its width that we have reliably got, and look at the dimensions of the rest of the ship, such as its length, its height, the length of its spike, the diameter of the spike. We have 2 spikes obviously at the front, so obviously we have to double that volume, but when we add up everything together, we get its total volume, 795 billion cubic meters. However, we have to understand that the ship isn't solid, it's hollow. So we'll say it's 90% hollow, divide everything by 10, 79.5 billion cubic meters. And that'll be the volume for the ship. Don't worry about understanding this right now. We're going to go over why this is important. Now, if we go back to using the energy of Boros' bombardment, which is previously stated with multi-continental, and remember that Saitama was easily doing more damage than this to the ship. In fact, it was stated he did 23% in 4 minutes. We can find out each second he was doing 0.0958% of damage to the ship. So if we be a lowball here, be generous, we can say that that small percentage was equivalent to the ship's bombardment. It should be less, as we know the ship didn't take that much from Tatsumaki's stronger bombardment, but we're being generous here. We can then say the 100% of the ship would be this massive amount, high into multi-continental. We then use the physical volume of the ship we mentioned earlier, so that each cubic meter would have this amount of energy, which is within the mountain ranges. This is also interesting because if we were using one of Boros' general with the black hole feet, it would actually be even higher than this. So each cubic centimeter or each cubic meter being this amount is actually a generous low end. Now, if we use this energy for each cubic meter of the ship and go back to the explosion that Boros causes on the ship, which, if you actually compare to the ship's volume, is actually 19.65% of the entire ship, would mean that the energy of his attack would still be in multi-continental, but it's much higher. It's kind of hard to see how it's much higher, but if you were to compare it with the likes of Armoured Boros, we would say that Release Boros is 205.04 times stronger than Armoured Boros. In fact, we can prove this 205 times multiplier is consistent. If you remember, Saitama could one-shot the likes of Armoured Boros. Then, when he becomes released, Saitama powers up and one-shots Boros' arm off. Then Boros, with one arm, is able to output more force than Saitama with 2 arms. So, in total, that's a 10 times a 10 times a 2, which is a 200 times multiplier. However, Boros is even stronger than that. Some of you might be asking, could we apply this 200 times multiplier to Boros' speed in the release form, like go from armored to release form? Is it a 200 times multiplier in speed? The answer is sadly no. The 2 times we hear about him talk about the difference between his armored form and like his release form, he always talks about the difference being power or strength. Such as when his arm's broken, say his too powerful strength. Or when his arm gets knocked off, he says he's surprised that Saitama can keep up with his power. There is no actual statement implying that his speed had such a massive jump. Also, just to show this difference is consistent, that it's power only, here are some other translations stating exactly such. Even Saitama agrees that it is a strength thing, calling Boros strong. Now, one other thing we can actually use for this sort of scaling for the explosion of Boros' release form that he does with his latent energy is that when Saitama later on does his moon jump, where he does a massive explosion on the moon, jumping really fast, he lands on the ship, he tilts the ship, and we can actually see the damage that he does to the ship. Now, just from looking at it, you can tell that this damage to the ship from the jump is a lot less than the massive explosion that Boros did in his release form. In fact, we can actually see the small leftovers of his release form explosion in the same scene, and it is still bigger. Now, when calculating the energy of Saitama's moon jump, we have quite a bit of a problem. The reason being that when he does his moon jump, we have the large spire for which all the dust is raised, as well as 3 different rings. We have to calculate each one of these individually, then total it up. Let's start off with the smallest ring. The pixel scaling is shown here, and with this pixel scaling we can get its area of the ring effect, the volume, the mass, and the gravitational potential energy, which was small country level. We then move on to the second ring, or the middle ring. This one is bigger because of how wide it is, but isn't as high. Overall, the energy using for this ring is large country level, much bigger than the first one. And for the final ring, it's the thinnest, but of course the widest one. This one has gravitational potential energy higher than all the other rings, but still large country level. Lastly, we have the spire that comes from the main portion of the moon jump. This is where when Saitama jumps up in the air, you can see that spire going upwards. The energy of this spire, compared to everything else, is quite small, only at a large island level. However, what we then do is we add up all of these results, and we find that the totality of all the energy in this moon jump, at least in the manga version, using gravitational potential energy, was large country level. Now let's do the anime version, because this one's actually even higher. In the anime, when the shockwave happens, it is far larger than the manga. There is multiple shockwaves, we'll be focusing on just the largest one. Starting off with this largest shockwave, we can measure its radius, thickness, height, and we can get the gravitational potential energy to be multi-continental, much higher than before. Now we can do the same thing with the spire. When we do the size of the spire, we'll find it's very similar to the other one, just a bit wider, and therefore the total gravitational potential energy is surprisingly a lot higher at multi-continental. Add these both together, our total energy also at multi-continental. However, in the anime, we have a time frame, so we can actually do kinetic energy. Let's do that now. Now, one thing I realized when looking at the anime version of this feat, the time frame for the ring of the shockwave, as well as the time frame for the spire, are different. The time frame for the ring is really tiny, 0.3 seconds. The time frame for the spire is more reasonably longer at 2.5 seconds. This makes the speed for the ring at 1.8 million meters per second, while the speed for the spire 200,000 meters per second. A very big difference. The kinetic energy for the ring is absolutely gigantic at planet level, while the kinetic energy for the spire is big but not as impressive at moon level. This gives a total kinetic energy that is planet level. So overall, when we're talking about this moon jump and its attack frequency, we'd say in the manga it's large country level, in the anime its gravitational potential energy is multi-continental, and the anime's kinetic energy would be planet level. Now the previous scaling was high into multi-continental, and with these three different ranges we don't really have a consistent end for how strong it is. Just keep in mind that Boros right now could be up to planet level, but so far just stick with the high multi-continental. Now, something even more impressive than this high multi-continental power that Boros has, 200 times stronger than Armoured Boros, is the fact that after making this blast, his back fist that hits Saitama was confirmed to damage Saitama. This is impressive, as the only other character in the series to do this is almost 100 chapters later, and that was Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garou, confirmed to be able to scratch Saitama. This would mean that feats that Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garou, while Boros may not fully scale to them, he would be in the same realm of power. For example, his passive existence being able to wipe all life on Earth, as well as the fact that he should be able to one-shot any monster form Garou, which includes a planet-level monster form Garou. We can imagine that Release Boros is likely in this planet-level tier of power. If you also read the One Punch Man Compass, we can get some surprising consistency with this, because in the One Punch Man Compass it says that Boros' latent power, which should be referring to his release form, is able to blast away entire planets. So once again, we have Release Boros at this planet level of power. Now, I know some people won't like the fact that I mentioned the front cover of one of the manga saying that Saitama took damage. They'll probably say that in the official release, this wasn't there, it was removed. And this is true, it was removed. But in the original Japanese, it was there. It did say he took damage. Furthermore, in the very moments afterwards, when Boros is talking about Saitama and the things that just happened, he mentions how his attack actually connected this time. Now, Boros was obviously hitting Saitama previously, so the difference here that he means by it connected is he actually damaged Saitama. We go to the page afterwards, and when he's talking to Saitama about how his species has the best regenerative properties, he then goes on to say that, yeah, Saitama will only take damage over time. This wouldn't make sense if Boros didn't damage him, so he did damage Saitama. And just to confirm this as well, if we look at other translations, they go as far to say not damage, but instead a wound, which is even bigger damage than just any little scratches that we see in the manga panel. Now, one thing I should bring up is that a lot of people, when they are detracting from Boros damaging Saitama, they like to bring up this one scene later on in Season 2, where Saitama's talking to King, and he talks about how he doesn't feel anything, or hasn't felt anything in a long while. However, this isn't actually true. If you were to read the very ending of the chapter beforehand, right before this, Saitama is complaining about in the martial art tournament, where he had his hopes up, expecting the hero hunter to show up, or see some martial artist that could do something to him, damage him, he was overall disappointed. And then he meets King, and he's expressing his disappointment of how he's unable to feel anything, which was something he just came to the conclusion of based on the previous encounters with the martial artists. When he then talks about how he doesn't feel anything, he mentions how he's so depressed that he's unable to feel any real emotion. King then challenges him to a game in which Saitama says, he won't feel anything. But then as soon as King mentions a handicap, Saitama clearly is proven wrong, as he starts getting emotional, he gets enraged. So Saitama is clearly just whining in the scene and not actually talking about whether or not in the past he's ever taken damage against an opponent. Now, if you remember, previously we scaled the lifting strength of Armoured Boros based on him being above his subordinates. When we did so, we got a lifting strength that was quite large, 117.7 trillion tons. But we just established that Release Boros has a power multiplier of at least 200 times. If we use this, we can get an even higher lifting strength, now it's 23.54 petatons. In conclusion, I would say that the attack potency of Boros would be as such at planet level. His speed would be 9.24 times the speed of light, and his lifting strength would be 23.54 petatons. Now, if you remember when we were talking about Release Boros, we talked about how his power was a 200 times multiplier, but strictly for power. We did this because when we looked at statements about his latent power, they always referred to it as a physical strength, not as a multiplier to all stats. However, with Meteoric Burst, it's actually stated directly that it increases both his speed and his power, beyond his physical limits. So not just that, but they're trying to hype it up even bigger than the 200 times multiplier. This is even confirmed in the One Punch Man compass, where his kinetic force is overpowering, and his speed of power is beyond the physical limits. He even goes an extra state to say that even Saitama is sort of clobbered. So now, if we go back to the statistics we gave Release Boros, his attack potency, his speed, and his lifting strength, we then look at now Meteoric Burst Boros. Each time we just times all the stats by 200. So his attack potency is now increased from planet level now up to large planet. His speed went from 9.24 times the speed of light to now 1,848.36 times the speed of light. His lifting strength went from 23.54 petatons to 4.71 exatons. Now, this is all the calculation I'm going to do with Meteoric Burst Boros. His feats either just scale to Saitama or some vague part of the ship and are indirect. So instead, we're going to look at each part of these stats, attack potency, speed, and lifting strength, and we're going to look at how consistent this is. I'm going to start off with speed, as I feel like that would be the most controversial and probably the most interesting at the same time. If we compare the speed stats for Meteoric Burst Boros at over 1,000 times the speed of light, we would see that he's quite similar to that of Garou in his monster form, or at least he's similar to Garou in his monster form in his fastest calculations, as the lower calculations are actually slower. You may think this is a bit different since Garou has some amazing speed feats, with the speed of Flashy Flash or with Platinum S, but we know that Boros should actually scale higher than Monster Garu for speed. We know this because when Boros in Meteoric Burst first shows up, he punches Saitama, and when he does so, Saitama is extremely shocked with Boros' speed. When Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garu shows up, he punches Saitama just like Boros does, and Saitama is once again shocked by the speed. Now this is really interesting because you can actually do a side-by-side comparison of the two characters and how they shocked Saitama. Now let's take this a step further. You see, when we mentioned Armoured Boros at the very start, we mentioned how Saitama could hit Boros so fast and blitz him by so much that he's not even drawn on the manga panel. Now, interestingly enough, Meteoric Burst Boros does this to Saitama. Not only is Saitama shocked, but when he then hits Saitama's face, we see a shockwave blast Saitama away and Saitama's no longer on the panel. You might be wondering, well, how far is this shockwave? Is it just a little bit we see here? The answer is no. We actually have a massive outside shot to see how far it is, and it is a large portion of the ship. Also, just to confirm that Saitama was in fact blitzed this entire shockwave and not just at the start or something, after the shockwave is done and gone the full distance, Boros then travels the entire shockwave, and we find that Saitama is still reacting to the punch on his face. You can see closely if you zoom in. Now before we do this calculation, we need to actually be careful of something called calc stacking. Calc stacking is when you have multiple calculations and you stack them together to get a result. Meaning, we wouldn't be able to use Saitama's previous reaction speed we calculated to be able to use this in the final result, as it would be stacking multiple calculations. However, what we can do is we can go a little bit lower into a lower basis for what Saitama's reaction should be, something that naturally would occur, and we can use that for the reaction speed of the calculation. For the basis of this calculation, we'll use the fact that Saitama, even while off guard and surprised by a telekinetic rock throw, was able to react at rocks moving at near the speed of light. This would mean that we can assume his reaction time is the speed of light and thus give him a reaction speed of 0.000000033 seconds. Earlier on we pixel scaled the length of a portion of the ship at 8.5 kilometers. We can then compare that to the entire attack distance, as Murata had simply cropped that image and put Boros' attack over it, to be 6,913.36 meters. Doing so, and using our assumptions we were making a second ago, we can say Boros is at least 6,913.35 times the speed of light. With this, we can say the speed for Boros has a range from 1,800 times the speed of light to 6,900 times the speed of light, which is consistent with Garu's scaling. Now let's move on to talk about Boros' attack potency. One of the best ways to show consistency for Meteoric Burst Boros' attack potency is to compare him with that of Garu. Now we can compare him to that of Monster Garu, but a best comparison is made with Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garu. Cosmic Fear Awakened Garu keeps changing in power. In fact, he keeps changing to the point where I had to give him a new level before he even copied a serious Saitama. I had to do this 3 different times, as you can see. But the details are very hard to see, and it doesn't give much for a comparison. So instead, allow me to make this comparison so that you can visually see it. When making this comparison, we need a baseline to start off with, so let's put Release Boros on the scale with this little tiny measurement. Next we have Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garu and his Nuclear Punch, far greater than that. And then 10 times greater than that, we have when Garu first copied Saitama's normal punch. Moving up the scale, what we get is Meteoric Burst Boros next. We see that he is several times higher than the Garu that copied Saitama's normal punch. However, after this, we then get the Gamma Ray Burst that Garu had. So we see that Boros is between these two versions of Cosmic Fear Mode Awakened Garu. And then, if you go back to the calculations mentioned earlier from the Garu video, you know that when Garu copied Saitama's normal punches, he was already Large Planet, and he was still Large Planet when he had the Gamma Ray Burst. So Boros being Large Planet and between these two is very consistent. Now, the scaling does actually rely on Boros being able to damage Saitama. However, as I'm about to show you, Boros can damage Saitama a lot. What we can then say is, using that of the One Punch Man compass, we can see that the third form of Boros, Meteoric Burst, is able to sort of clobber Saitama, which we can actually see in the anime. In the anime version, when he is punching Saitama around the face several times, at least on 3 different occasions, we can see Saitama take damage. This is important because it means that the suppressed normal Saitama was surpassed by Meteoric Burst Boros. It wasn't until he comes back from the moon that Saitama is shown even stronger. In fact, if we look at a clip of when Saitama comes back from the moon, instead of getting clobbered, he doesn't even move anymore. He's so much stronger, and then he proceeds to basically one-shot Boros. Also, just to mention that Saitama in his normal mode has different levels of power. It's stated by Garu after copying Saitama and one-shotting him with the Gamma Ray Burst that he knows that Saitama wasn't going all out. However, much like Boros, who thought that Saitama's powers are immeasurable, neither of them would be able to sense the power of serious Saitama. The reason being is, serious Saitama is technically considered like a transformation type thing. If you look at the One Punch Man Hero Guidebook, we see that the uttering of Sirius, it allows Saitama to reach a new dimension of power, which really just means that he's much, much more powerful, but it's trying to explain that it's completely different than his normal state. This would make sense as both Boros and Garu cannot measure the level of serious Saitama, but if they know that Saitama is still holding back or he's got more power in him, they're just referring to a higher level of normal Saitama. I could keep ranting on about different ways you could prove that Meteoric Burst Boros consistently is at a large planet level. However, instead I'm going to go more into that when I talk about the Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon later on. With that being said, consider this Boros' attack potency, speed, and lifting strength in his Meteoric Burst state. Now to move on to the Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon. As expected by anyone watching this video, when talking about the Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon, we talk about how it was able to obliterate a star, at least according to the One Punch Man compass. One Punch Man compass English edition literally says this, and in the Japanese, many people debate whether or not it says this, but the translation would correctly say that it is able to destroy a star. I should address the fact that some people believe the translation to be mistaken or incorrect. The reason being is, in Japanese, the word used for star on its own, as well as the word used for planet, is the same. However, this will not matter for this particular guide. Earlier on in the exact same guidebook, in fact on the same page, talks about how the latent energy of Boros could destroy planets. And if they could translate the difference between planets and star once, they can do it again. Furthermore, in the actual English translation, you'll notice it uses the name Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon, where they have to translate the word star. And when they do so correctly. So why wouldn't they be able to translate it later on? It just doesn't make sense. Therefore, at least in the One Punch Man compass, Boros' Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon should be star level. Another thing people try and use to detract from this being star level is using one particular guide where they say that in this scene where Boros uses the Collapsing Star Roaring Cannon, it's only able to destroy the Earth. Or they might use the manga where Boros would say he can destroy the surface of the Earth. However, both of these are very simple to explain, where if you just look at something like Dragon Ball, for example, when Frieza fought Toppo, he said to Toppo that he could destroy an entire planet. Now, if I was to ask the question, do you think Dragon Ball Super Full Power Final Form Frieza is just planetary? The answer would be no. Frieza's not talking about his full power, he's talking about something he can do, an achievement. And this is what Boros is doing here. He's not saying my full power can destroy that of a planet, he's saying I'm going to destroy the planet. And that slight difference makes the statements irrelevant. He can destroy the planet, therefore he can destroy the planet. It does not detract from the star level statement whatsoever, just as Frieza's statement doesn't detract from his power whatsoever. However, even in the guide, where they say that Boros can only destroy a planet, we can actually use this guide another way to show that the collapsing star roaring cannon is in fact star level. We start off by scaling it to the serious punch and what percentage of the serious punch it scales to. When the serious punch and the raw cannon clash, what we see is a shockwave that narratively should represent the difference in power between each other. So if we calculate the difference in the shockwaves, we should calculate the difference in the collapsing star roaring cannon and Saitama's serious punch. Let's do this. Starting off with the area of which Saitama had, we need to know its distance, how far it went, as well as the width at the very end. With such, we get the area to be 2 trillion square meters. Now for Boros, we have to do half of it and then double it because it gets split into 2 halves. Look at the length of the blast we see. The width of it, we get its area for half at 195 billion square meters. And after this, we get the total area as 391 billion square meters. Overall, this means that the collapsing star roaring cannon should be 18.66% the power of Saitama's serious punch. Now, one thing to consider before we make a comparison between the collapsing star roaring cannon and Saitama's serious punch is the serious punch doesn't have a set level of power. In fact, we can just use the example of the Saitama that used the serious punch on Elder Centipede, Evil Natural Ocean, and Cosmic Garu would all be at different levels. Like, we don't see the serious punch used against Elder Centipede popping a hole in the sky. Therefore, we need to actually define the level of a serious punch that Saitama would use when he hits Boros. How we do this is we simply use that guide as mentioned a moment ago, talking about Saitama and how his serious form works. That's only really talking about the Season 1 Saitama and early parts of Season 2, where it actually has the statistics for how powerful they think Saitama should be. Next, from the exact same databook as that of Saitama's stats, we get the stats for both Tatsumaki and Tank Top Tiger. With this information, we can then start analysing their power. For example, Tank Top Tiger has a power of 4. We'll work out the energy of what that means in just a moment. Tatsumaki's power in the guidebook is stated to be a 9. We know how much energy this would be, and the guidebook even mentions that of the Boros ship, so we know that this energy should be around the multi-continental energy that she overpowered. And of course, we're going to then estimate the power of Saitama at a 15. In regarding how powerful Tank Top Tiger is, we can use just one calculation of Versus Battle Wiki, where they talk about how strong Saitama was as a 12-year-old before he ever started training, for which they had a wall-level amount of energy at 4 million joules. We can then use this to say the equation for each power level within the guidebook. So Saitama at a 15 would have a massive amount of energy at solar system level. Now that we have the energy that Saitama should have according to the guidebook, we can then say that the collapsing star roaring cannon, as mentioned earlier, was 18.66% of Saitama's serious punch, and we get the energy for the collapsing star roaring cannon to still be solar system level. Now this is interesting because this is the same guidebook that called Boros' raw cannon planet level has now allowed it to be solar system level. There is a reason why though. The explanation for why the guidebook has this inconsistency inside of it is because of the way it's written. For example, when we start off looking at the Saitama page, you will actually notice at the very top of it, it has this little thing where it is Genos saying that he disagrees with the Hero Association and then states his facts about what he thinks Saitama is. In other words, what the Hero Association think is based on how all these characters are written. We know this furthermore because King's got a maxed out stat in every stat point, despite the fact that he actually isn't as strong as the Hero Association think he is. This is also confirmed at the very front of the databook, where they pretend it's an actual, databook handed out by the Hero Association in verse. And this is also furthermore shown with the likes of Fubuki, where she's giving a quote about Blast, and it's just a rumor, it's not an actual statement about what he can do. Things like this is just about opinions and how people in verse view one another, and not actually the level of power these characters are capable of. And because of such, it isn't the most reliable source. So if you do use this, you could get Boros to planet, you could get him to solar system. I will not be using it for Boros' power. This would mean that the only guide that actually talks about Boros' power in a literal sense would be the One Punch Man compass, as previously mentioned, which had Boros at star level. This would be the power of the collapsing star roaring cannon, and it is the most consistent based on the scaling shown in this video. Did you know? Boros could have survived Saitama's serious punch. After the serious punch, we see his corpse still alive, talking to Saitama. And we see earlier that he was able to come from a splat of blood and just an eye, meaning he can definitely regenerate from this rotting corpse. The reason why he doesn't regenerate is because of how his regeneration works. His regeneration works by putting his latent energy into his body to accelerate his healing at a superhuman rate. However, if you know the collapsing star roaring cannon, he already put all his power into the blast. So the reason why he couldn't regenerate is because he literally put all his energy in the blast and had none left to regenerate with. Otherwise, Boros could actually survive the serious punch from Saitama. Let's finish off the video with a quick montage summary of each one of Boros' forms and the collapsing star roaring cannon's capabilities. Thank you everyone for watching. In the process of making this video, I had help from a friend of mine called Godzilla King of the Monsters, so I'll link his channel here at the end of it instead of me. Of course, the other channels linked to be Korin, Keefe and Captain Forest. I also put a recommended video here. I wonder how many people are going to get the old Garu video I did, but the recommended one, comment down below, see what it is. Comment down below any other suggestions, your thoughts on the video, whatever. Discord server in the description if you want to join it and talk to me. And with that, I hope you all have a good day. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.